My name's Dale, and welcome back to Metal Tips and Tricks. This is part 2 of how to buy a metal lathe. In the first one, I covered how to analyze the bed and what shape it is. I talked about the tailstock. I talked about this whole area, the apron and the cross slide. So now we're going to continue with the rest of the lathe and this part back here. Let's move on to the chuck and examine that. One of the things you're going to want to do is, if it's 3-jaw or 4-jaw, it doesn't matter, you're going to want to check both of them. Is there a lot of play in the jaws themselves? Are they worn out at all? Are you going to have to regrind it? Remember, anytime you find a problem, notate it, and it makes the seller a little more nervous and a little more concerned and inspires him to sell it for a cheaper price. So let's take the chuck off. This has what's called a D3 mount, and it has 3 pins that mount into here, and by tightening cams, it pulls it in. Well, also, when it pulls it in, something else happens. If the chucks aren't cleaned out in here, like this one is right now, is those shavings get embedded into this surface, and these surfaces have to match up identically. And to regrind these, well, let's just say it's not an easy task to regrind these, and it's not something I would want to try to do. So if this is badly damaged and dinged up, to me, you really have to be careful and consider walking away from the machine. You'll also want to check the inside spindle bore here, make sure it's not all rusty or pitty. Now some of you will go, well, what do you need that for? I never put anything in there. Well, some of us do. I've got a C5 collet holder that goes in here. I also have a center that goes in here that I use from time to time. So you do want to make sure that's in good condition. Also, there may be a time that you want to sell this machine and somebody else watched my video and, well, is going to hold you accountable. So remember, there's a two-edged sword out there. So let's put the chuck back on. We want to make sure that the chuck is running fairly true. The thing is it consistent? That's the real question. So let's get back to our indicator. Going to simply set the indicator up and just spin it, see how it does. This one here is giving me a fluctuation of about 1/1000th, which is excellent. Let's loosen it up, rotate the bar, see what happens. So we're about 2/1000ths there. Loosen it up, rotate it. Now this bar is not in great shape, so we can give quite an allowance there, and that's going to be fine. We want to check the force this way. Now some of you are going to think, well, it doesn't matter. There's thrust bearings in here that press up against it. I got my tailstock, that pushes up against it and lines everything out. Well, a lot of time you're not using your tailstock. So if this has a lot of slop this way, it's going to cause you some problems. So let's look at this. This one is 0. What's great about a newer head like this is there a Timken bearing or a tapered bearing. So you're able to put them together with great tolerances. If this were a lathe with a bushing on it or a Babbitt bearing, well, things kind of change. If you got 1/1000ths in and out, you're doing really good. So let's check the top here. Now we want to see how much movement is in on the lateral this way. Excellent. So the bearings, everything checks out great here. It's time to look at the transmission that drives the head and changes the speed. Now this one here is a gear head. The advantage to a gear head is they're usually quieter, they're easier to change, and they have a better transference of power from the motor to here. Belts can be very inefficient and burn up a lot of your energy. This one here is has 6 speeds, or I should say 6 gear changes here for a total of 9 different speeds. And then I can go back on the motor, step it over so I can get another 9 speeds. So this will give me a total of 18 speeds. One of the challenges with this particular metal lathe is the ratios or the different speeds don't, how do I want to say, fit together well. Like I can go from 90 to 240, kind of a large jump, then I can go from 240 to 260, which really isn't a difference in speed. So I would say this isn't a very well-designed transmission, but it still works quite well. Challenges with transmission is there's a lot of gears inside here, and as we run a speed test on it, we want to be very cognizant of hearing grinding or clicking sounds. Now when you open up the top of this, you'll look inside and you'll manually rotate this, and you're going to look at every gear inside here and study each tooth. You're going to make sure there's no teeth missing or any strange marks that would say there's a problem. And also as you're rotating it manually, listen for it. Change the gears here. See how they change. Got a little grind here. That grind is actually because it's not engaged correctly. All these are flat tooth gears, so they don't mesh really well. You just have to be aware that if it doesn't go into gear, you just have to rotate until the gears come together and don't hit on top of each other. A visual inspection here is really important. The other thing is a magnet on a stick. So this is bathed in oil. So there's a puddle of oil in the bottom, and as this is running, it splashes up and feeds the oil. Well, that oil can hide some secrets for you that you want to discover, and you simply want to take a magnet, run it in the oil, go into every corner, every space, look at the end, and see what's on there. There may be a missing tooth. There may be a lot of metal, something you want to be aware of. There will always be, some sort of metal filings in there, but if there's big chunks, we might have a problem. So you want to be careful. If there's a tooth missing in here, I would say walk away from the machine. Let's say somebody's asking $1,000 for this, and I find a tooth in there that's missing, and you can hear it clicking when you run it. To replace that gear would take several days to take this apart, put it back together again, and there's no guarantee you can buy a gear. You'd probably have to manufacture one. Well, that ends up being a lot of work, and if I found a broken tooth in there and he asked $1,000 for it and lowered it down to $500, I still might walk away from the machine. I don't know. It would matter how bad it is just because of the complications of getting in there and getting back out. If we were to look at the Clausing lathe over there, its transmission is so incredibly complicated that I would never even attempt taking it apart, at least not today. So let's talk about this a little bit. Run it through every gear change with the motor running. And one thing I haven't talked about, if you can't plug the lathe in to test it, that drops the price in half for me. You don't want to take a risk, because a motor being burned out isn't a big deal. It's, I can buy motors for next to nothing. But when you attach the motor to it, it will help you diagnose if this machine is healthy. And I wouldn't even want to get near it. I mean, I can go through all this manually, but to actually hear it run at the different speeds, the low speeds and the high speeds, will help you, figure out what else is wrong. There's also another lever here. This one changes the rotation for when it transfers this shaft down into these, so you can change the direction of those so it feeds the carriage either left or right or in or out. And that's where that happens there. So that's all up in this area. So let's go down into where all the gear changing is and talk about what can happen here and how to study it and make sure that it's working properly. As we advance through evaluating our metal lathe, we now get to the quick change gearbox. Now, this is a personal preference of mine. I will not buy a lathe unless it has a quick change gearbox. The reason is they just work so well, they're so efficient, and I'm kind of lazy. I don't want to have to figure out what gears I need for different things. And you end up using them it's not about threading, but it's about feeding your cutter through your material at the correct rates. And when you have a quick change gear post or a gear box, it's just much easier to experiment and explore different options. And at the end of the day, this doesn't cost that much more on the lathe, you know, it doesn't, how do I want to say, it doesn't change the price that much whether it has it or not. So just buy one with it, wait until you get it. But if you don't take my advice on that, make sure that the stack of gears that come with it is complete. And you'll have to do that by finding different literature on it. Another way is you can just look at it, because when you stack up the gears, they'll cone up like a Christmas tree. And if there's one missing, you'll see there'll be a different size in there and know it's not right. So this quick change gear post, this quick change gearbox actually is broken down into two sections. There is an A, B, C, D, E section. This is for very coarse settings. And then you have 1 through 8, and that's for fine settings, so it kind of fills in those little gaps. So that means there's a lot of gears in here and the potential for a lot of damage. So you want to inspect it very closely. You want to run it through every possible combination that is available. And literally, well, I shouldn't say not every combination, but you want to run it through all 8 of these gears and all 5 of these gears to make sure you're not hearing any clicking or any grinding. Again, clicking means there's probably a bad tooth. If there's grinding, that means there's something out of alignment. Also, you want to make sure that these brackets are straight. Sometimes these machines get hit by something or tipped over, and that's going to show you some evidence there. Also, these handles need to be straight and turning correctly, because at any time these can get damaged, of course, by the machine falling over. Another piece of advice I want to give you guys when moving a lathe is I remove all handles and the tail stock and the compound rest when moving a lathe, just to prevent them from getting damaged. It also takes some of the weight off the machine, making it easier to move around. Now you've done an inspection that you can outside here. Now you want to look up underneath here with like an inspection mirror. Get under here and look around and see what there is. If you don't have a mirror, you can get up under here, look underneath. But my favorite is just to go to my phone and reach it up under here. And if you want to, you can take pictures. Look at the picture. Zoom in on it. You can analyze the different gears, whatever you have, very easily. But remember, you need to still rotate it, go through the gears, see what happens. This here, this lever changes from the top lead screw to the drive shaft down here. And you'll want to try that in the different positions and hear how it sounds here. This will reverse everything. You'll want to hear some of this stuff in reverse, but the real key is to make sure there's no missing gears. So let's come around here to the side. That gear's on the side here, very accessible. What's great about this side, it's very accessible. If a gear is broken or worn, they're easy to replace. Make sure that the gears aren't fitting too tight. A little bit of movement to the gears in here. If they're too tight, they make too much noise and they wear out quickly. So again, just be aware of that. There's a motor on this side. Look at the motor. Is it clean? Is it dirty? What kind of shape is it in? Also check the horsepower of the motor. A lathe this size should be running at least a 1-horse motor at very minimum. This one here is set up for a 2. If it had like a 5-horse motor on it, I'd be very, very concerned, because that's way too much motor for this small of a lathe. The V-belts aren't designed for it, and especially the gears and the shafting inside is not designed for that big a motor. So I'd be very leery, and I would double check everything again if I discovered it was a 5-horse motor on this size lathe. This one here, I'd go up to a 3-horse, and it should be okay. Also, look at the V-belts. Not a big deal, easy to replace, but it's just something to know about. Check the condition of the pulleys. Are the pulleys in good shape? Okay, are they cracked? Do they have a chip in them? Do they show any signs of wear? Are they just cheap, you know, cast pot metal? Or are they cast steel that have been turned like these are? Excellent Something else is to make sure that the pulleys are attached to their shafts and they're not wobbling around any. If they're wobbling around at all, boring out a pulley is no big deal, but replacing a shaft or repairing a shaft really is. And I'll tell you, a repair like that takes $100 right off a lathe for me, because I know I've done it several times and it's a real headache. And if you have to rebuild the shaft on the motor, it's kind of a done deal. You know, you might as well throw the motor away unless you've got a way to put it into a lathe, because if you take that motor off and put that shaft, that arbor, in this lathe, what's going to drive this? You're going to have to switch motors around. So it's kind of a headache. Let me take you over to a table full of tooling that I think should come with a lathe. One of the fun things about buying a lathe is discovering tooling that comes along with it. And tooling is one of those funny things, is it really doesn't add that much value to a lathe, but if it has it, it should make it more valuable to you. Because if you have to buy any of this stuff separate from the lathe, it's going to cost quite a bit of money. But it is just one of those little funny side notes. And when we're talking about tooling, tooling is anything that you add to the machine that adds functionality to it. So like a 3-jaw chuck or a 4-jaw chuck, that is tooling that adds functionality to it. If I could only have one chuck, of course, it would be a 4-jaw chuck, because you can do more accurate stuff with it. Another thing you can get is a 5C collet adapter, and this one simply fits in. You take the chuck off, this cone fits in the main shaft, this goes on all the way through the shaft, screws onto the collet, pulls the collet in, so it works that way. Another piece of tooling you want to look for are different types of centers. We have live centers, you know, dead centers which don't rotate. You can see this one here has been well used. And you want to look at the quality of them. You know, I really hate cheap centers. You can buy them, you know, on eBay for $15, but you do really get what you pay for. And when you think about how much stress is applied to one of these, you really don't want to trust a cheap one on a very expensive piece of metal or a part that you're working on. Another thing is you're going to want is some sort of drill chuck. Now, a lot of lathes will end up coming with a lantern tool post like this, and they'll have different arms with them. These are not my favorite, but you do want a lathe that has one, because there are times that I get into a part where a traditional Aloris tool post like this just is too big to get into certain areas. So they do have value. Also, you end up getting a box of rusty cutters. You always want to take those whenever you can. Very important. Here's a benefit, is I've got a steady rest. This one here runs on brass, not my favorite. I'd rather have bearings. This one here is also doesn't run a very large diameter, so it's kind of a drawback with the design of this lathe. Another great piece of tooling is what's called a follow rest. And the follow rest actually attaches right onto your carriage and helps you, actually, I had it backwards. Attaches onto your carriage and helps you stabilize smaller pieces. We also have a faceplate that came with this lathe. So this lathe came really well tooled, and the backstory on this Enco lathe is kind of fun. You know, we look at Craigslist, and if it doesn't show a picture and doesn't have a great description, we kind of ignore it. Well, I got to tell you guys, that's where my best deals come from. This here, the ad just said, Enco metal lathe, and no photograph. So I call the guy up, and he tells me about the lathe. And what it was in a bakery. And it was a small bakery that had to have repairs done to machinery, but they had a machine shop nearby that they'd take things to during the weekday and the weekend, or I should say on Saturdays. But on Sundays, the machine shop was closed, so they would hire a machinist to come in and fix things, and that's what the lathe was there for. They also had a milling machine. Well, it almost never, ever got used. This thing still had, and probably still has, cosmoline on a couple of the parts that I don't use it very often. And it was just one of those great ads for $500. I never even plugged the thing in. I just bought it. I bought it sight unseen, drove down there as fast as I could, handed him my money, put it in the back of the truck, and drove home. And it came with all this tooling. And it was just one of those great opportunities. I call this lathe my baker's lathe because it came out of a bakery. Well, there we go. That's kind of a great background of how to buy a metal lathe. You want to have tooling, you want to make sure it has some tooling with it. You want to make sure you bring tools with you and cleaning supplies so you can inspect the machine. You want to go through the entire machine, operate every lever, check every gear. Be careful during this time. A good inspection for me takes about an hour if there's easy access to the lathe. Sometimes they're hiding in a back corner someplace in a dark place. So remember to bring an extra flashlight or two. Don't forget to bring your phone. You can take pictures of it. Also, go to the websites. Go to vintagemachinery.org and find out information. When you talk to the guy on the phone, find out exactly all the information he has on the lathe, like what's the serial number? There's always a serial number on the bed. Who's it made by? All that stuff. Do that research up front before you get there. Also print out any manuals you can find. Another great source, which I also like, is lathe.co.uk. He also has some wonderful resources and a lot of back history on metal lathes. So those are two really great resources. Also some friends you can call up and go that way. So there we are in a nutshell. That's how I inspect a lathe. Now, don't send me any questions about what is my favorite lathe or what lathe would I buy or what lathe should I buy. I don't have a clue. Okay? I just buy things I find that are great deals, and I make that same suggestion to you. It's better to buy a lathe and learn about it and sell it and buy another one than it is not to own a lathe at all. All right, guys, until next time, go out in your shop or check Craigslist and buy something cool. Thanks. Hey guys, welcome back to Metal Tips and Tricks. Today I want to talk about buying a metal lathe and the process I go through to discover what's strong about a metal lathe and what's weak to determine its price. Now, I have never found a lathe that I wouldn't buy, but I will say I've bought a lot of lathes that I shouldn't, and I want to help you guys through those challenges. Now, when you want to buy a lathe, where do you find them? My discoveries have always been on Craigslist. I know you can go to auctions. The challenge with auctions is you end up spending a lot of time, and then when it comes to the item you want to buy, well, there's always somebody there that just keeps bidding it up and taking it well past what it's worth. And well, sometimes our egos get involved and we keep going higher and spend more money than we actually should on something. So auctions are not my favorite place. My favorite place to locate a new lathe is actually on Craigslist. And I have bought lathes on Craigslist when I lived in Washington State, when I lived in Oregon, when I lived in Idaho, California, Georgia, and there's a lot of great opportunities out there if you have patience. Now, I know a lot of you are going to ask, what is my favorite metal lathe? I don't have an answer for you. It's kind of like the newest lathe I bought is my favorite metal lathe. So please don't ask me what lathe I should buy because I really don't have an answer for you. But I will have an answer that my goal is to never spend more than $1,000 on a lathe. All the lathes I have in my shop, this Entco, my Hardinge, my Clausing over here, I never paid more than, well, the Clausing I paid $750, $500. The Hardinge I paid, I think, $800 for it. So great opportunities are out there if you are truly patient. And The way I look at a lathe, I start at $1,000 and I add to it based on how much tooling is with it, or I subtract on it based on how little tooling or what shape the lathe is in. And that is kind of what we want to talk about here, is determine, is the lathe worth buying, and what is the price that you should be paying for in the condition it's in. So when I go out to go look at a lathe, there's a box of stuff I bring with me. A magnet on a stick so I can get into certain places. I'll carry a digital caliper, mics, different types of wrenches, of course a crescent wrench, pliers, all sorts of stuff. You're going to need screwdrivers, a flathead, and a Phillips, usually just the normal standard size works. Allen wrenches, you never know if it's going to be metric or English or both. Hopefully there won't be any Whitworth. You're going to want to have some sort of mag base with a dial indicator on it, so you can get in and check some parts. I like to have cleaners with me. This one has paint thinner in it. This one has industrial purple. And of course you'll need paper towels. And what inspection wouldn't be an inspection unless you had some Scotch-Brite pads. And the Scotch-Brite pads kind of fit into this category because mattering how thick the grease is or how much rust is on it, you're going to really appreciate having that. And these are just some of the general tools I bring along with me. I also forgot a tape measure. Tape measure serves a lot of purposes. One is to make sure that it is the size that it was advertised. Also, you want to measure it to make sure it's going to fit in your shop or in the back of your truck or your trailer when it's time to move it. And let's take a look at this lathe and inspect it as though I were going to buy it. You find an ad on Craigslist and you call the person, you ask them a few questions like, why are you selling the lathe? What comes with the lathe? And you determine that it's worth your time to go look at it. You look at the lathe, the first thing you've got to look at is the bedways. You get to study the bedways and when they were in pristine condition, and that's usually at this side because it gets very little wear. And you want to look at this side and you want to come over. You want to come over to here and compare the two surfaces. Now, a great way of comparing is, of course, visual. You know, you've got some tools on board. You can clean this off a little bit. You've got a Brillo pad, whatever you need to get this down to look at the original surface. And what you'll find out is the ways on here do not, how do I want to say, contact. So here you'll usually see a little hollow spot or a little bit of wear. And what you want to do is just simply feel it. If you can feel it with your fingernail, it's okay. If you can feel it when you touch it, well, those little edges, you're going to have to determine. If this is down, let's say, 2 or 3 thousandths, let's say we evaluated that, that's okay. You're not going to go crazy. The lathe is going to work okay for you. Now, the very first large metal lathe I ever bought was a Sheldon, and it was, well, let's say worn out was an understatement, and I didn't know what to look for. This was probably a 1/16 of an inch lower here than it was at this point and at this point. That is an unusable lathe. I actually ended up learning a lot on that lathe, reground it, resurfaced it, and got it to work, but it was a lot of time invested in it. Something else you can look at is usually on the top of these V-ways there's a flat area, and you can look at that width there and compare it to the width down here. And also sometimes this area here is actually in really good shape and you can compare it to. If this is worn out or you're seeing signs it's kind of concerning you, I would just walk away, because the bed really is the foundation to the lathe. Now let's talk about the tailstock next. A lot of people kind of ignore the tailstock, and you don't want to. You really want to look at it very closely. You want to check to make sure that it moves in and out freely. And the most important is you want to put your finger inside this bore and see how it feels. Because if this is worn out, shattered, feeling rough inside, you are not going to have a successful time using this lathe. You can technically put a ream in here, clean this out, but this is a hardened way, and it would be very, I shouldn't say a hardened way, it's a hard surface, and it'd be very difficult to clean that out correctly. So if that has problems, I would probably walk away. Or let's say we start out with $1,000. Let's say we start out with a base number of $1,000 for a lathe. If I have problems with that, I'd take $500 off of it right there. That's all I would offer them, the guys, $500, because to fix this is really hard. You can't really turn down this because it's actually ground to fit this machine. Now, if the tailstock sits a little low, that's okay because you can put shims under here and make it work without a problem. But you do want to make sure that the tailstock is in really good shape, because remember, anytime you work on a lathe or buy a new machine, the shortcomings are missing parts. And missing parts, you'll end up spending more on those than you did for the entire machine. So as you're looking through this, make sure that everything is here. Now let's talk about the cross slide and the apron here. Most lathes are very similar in general until you get down into this part here. There's a lot of extra levers and switches and rods that you have to contend with. And usually the bigger the lathe, the more complicated it is. Sometimes the older lathes get even more complicated. So you want to get yourself familiar. And one of my suggestions is to go to vintagemachinery.org. It's a great website sponsored by Keith Rucker. And there you can look up the lathes and find different types of manuals for them. Also, there's one over in the UK called lathe.co.uk, another great resource to find information on a lathe and find out what all this stuff down here does. Now, the first handle activates a spur gear that goes along this rack gear. And you want to check out this rack, make sure that the teeth are consistent from this side to this side. Remember, most of the wear is going to be over here. There'll always be a little bit of slop. That is just the way it is because of the way the gears are made. There'll always be a little bit of problem there. Now remember that lathe I told you about that I reground the bed on it? Well, that of course lowers the whole carriage, making this so it didn't engage, so I had to shim up the carriage to get it to work. Next, you'll want to check out the lead screw and make sure that it doesn't have any wear in this area. And you can simply do that by, well, there's actually a lot of different methods. One, you'll visually check it out. If it's dirty, you got to clean it up. You got to take a brush to it, spray it down with paint thinner, clean that up, really closely inspect it, because if that screw is not in good shape, you're not going to get accurate threading. A good way to just test it is to take your pitch gauge and just put it up against here and take a look. Most of these are Acme, but that's okay. You can use a standard pitch gauge and just kind of get a sense. If it doesn't feel right, it's not right. You'll know when you put that in there that it feels right. Check it again on both ends. Now, this one here has 3 different rods. This one here acts very similar to the lead screw, but what it does, it has a slot in it and a gear, so when this rotates, it activates the gear and actually powers this handle to this spur gear. And it's one of those things you end up using for different speeds and feeds. Just like this one here is basically set up for threading. This one here, you can do a lot finer feeds. The third rod here turns the lathe on and off. It's really kind of nice that when you're working, you have this handle in this area and simply rotates it. Now, you want to check to make sure that these rods are not bent. Now, it's really easy on these 2 rods because all you have to do is turn the lathe on, and you'll see if it's out of alignment. It'll show in a lot of evidence. It'll be, swinging out of balance. Same with this rod here. If it wasn't straight, it would be very obvious. Next, you'll want to try the different ways of activating the transmission. This one here is a lock nut. What it does, it's a half nut that clamps onto the lead screw. Turn the lathe on and just try it. See how it fits. This one here is, of course, an excellent shape. This also has a threading dial. That's not a deal breaker, but I wouldn't buy a lathe that doesn't have one, except I did buy a lathe that didn't have one, the Hardinge, and it doesn't have one. So, like I say, this is different on all lathes. Next, this lever here controls the cross feed and is activated by this rod also. So once we're running, try it down. That's going to activate the cross slide. If I go up, it activates the Z-axis. Listen for the different sounds as you're testing it. If you're hearing any clicks or rattles or something that doesn't sound solid, you know, negotiate a better deal. Again, let's say we start out $1,000 and I hear something clicking in here. Well, that's about, you know, I would analyze it very carefully. I'd try to figure it out. If it's a broken gear, if I'm hearing a click, click, click that's very consistent, that's usually a damage in a gear, you know, that's $350 worth of work to me. I don't even know if I'll be able to get the gear once I get in there. Also, what can happen if it's a broken gear, sometimes you'll engage it and that gear will just be in that spot where it's missing the tooth and it won't turn and it won't do anything. You'll get very frustrated. So make sure you check that. Make sure you listen very closely for the whole thing. Next, we want to talk about the cross slide and the compound slide. The cross slide is really the workhorse on the metal lathe, and everything really depends on, is it tight? So, you know, check it out, move it around a little bit. Also grab your Noga or your indicator holder, set it up someplace rigid, and just see what type of movement you get when moving this around. If you're moving it around and you're out, let's say, 1/1000th of an inch, it's not the end of the world. Usually you can tighten it up, and that's the next thing I want to talk about is the gibs on here are adjustable, and on this type of lathe and many lathes, the gib is actually a wedge that moves back and forth and tightens it up. What I want you to do is get out your screwdriver and actually tighten this up. Rack it all the way one way, rack it all the way back to the other end. And if it starts to bind going one way or another, back it off a little bit until it's smooth operation. Check it here, see how it's moving, and hopefully you're not finding a big variance. Because if there's a lot of slop here yet, you can tighten down the gibs and take away all that slop, but you're going to be cranking on the handle really tight, and it should move really nice. It should be a pleasure to use. And this one here, again, like I said, is also powered, which is a great advantage. When you get into larger lathes, usually they are. The smaller ones aren't. It's not a deal breaker on buying a lathe for me. I don't use it as often as I could. Now the cross slide here, you want to unbolt it, you want to swivel it around, see how it feels. Again, you're going to run the handle all the way one way, all the way the other, see if it binds up, put the indicator on here, test, you know, the slop in it both ways. You know, also I didn't talk about the slop in this, is there's lateral slop this way just because the screw gets moved out. This one here is pretty tight because it's a fairly new lathe, but you can learn how to work around that when you always push the tool in instead of pull it out. So it's not a deal breaker, it's just a frustration. This one here, the same thing. You'll want to put an indicator, test how much is this way, but it's also a point as you find little things that are wrong, just notate it, type it into your iPhone, whatever you have. And when you're talking to the person, go, you know, these are the things I found. And usually they're standing there and you're finding them. And you can kind of hee-haw about it, go, oh, that lead screws out a little bit, and look at that slop. I don't know, let me keep looking. And, well, you'll see the price it's easier to get the price down lower. And that's kind of the overview of the carriage. Like I said, there's different ones that'll have clutches on them. You'll want to try everything you can. And again, when you made that initial phone call, find out what the number is on the lathe. Also, on the corner here of the lathe, there's always a serial number. And sometimes you can actually look up the serial number like on a South Bend and get the information of when it was made and find the documentation on it, so you can understand how everything works on and around this part of the lathe. So that's the end of part 1 of how to buy a metal lathe. In part 2, we're going to cover this whole area and also talk about tooling that comes with the lathe. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give me some thumbs up. Also, love to hear your positive comments. And remember, until next time, go out in your shop and build something cool. Thanks.